Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Are We Moving Towards Siteless Clinical Trials? Exploring the Current and Future Potential of Home-Based Studies. My name is Colleen Lezovitz and I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at Worldwide Clinical Trials. Before we kick things off, I wanted to go over a few things. All attendees are on mute, but please utilize the Q&A window to submit questions at any time pertaining to the presentation, as we will be reserving time for Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email with a link to access the on-demand, so keep an eye out for that either tomorrow or Monday. At this time, I would like to hand things over to our host, Worldwide's Chief Medical and Scientific Officer, Dr. Michael Murphy. Dr. Murphy?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Murphy. I'm Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for Worldwide Clinical Trials, and it's really a pleasure to introduce you to a very exciting topic. My particular passion is translational medicine, everything from animal to man, but the equally challenging development to commercialization transition. My interest in this particular topic stems from a belief that the concept has significant implications for transforming the way we design and operationalize studies. I'm joined today by a number of other colleagues. Each will review the topic from their own unique perspectives. So Doug, if you could, please.
Hi, my name is Doug Lytle. I'm the Executive Director of Clinical Assessment Technologies within Worldwide Clinical Trials. Clinical Assessment Technologies is a separate department within Worldwide Clinical Trials that focuses on the reliability of subjective assessments. We do a lot of work in CNS areas, but we do work across all areas, ensuring that the right scales are managed, that training is delivered appropriately to sites, and then we do very specialized monitoring of those subjective endpoints throughout the study. My particular interest in this topic is, as we see the move to more and more home-based studies, there will have to be considerations for assessments that are done outside of the devices and the traditional or non-traditional ways that we're thinking about implementing studies within home-based settings. And we'll discuss that a little bit more later in the presentation. Lorna will be the next to present.
Hello everyone, my name is Lorna Graham and I'm an Associate Director of Project Management at WCT Evidence. So the Evidence Group is a group that is completely standalone and actually manages all observational registries and late-stage research programs within WCT. And I'm particularly passionate about science, just like Dr. Murphy, and I'm also very passionate about technology, and that's why I'm interested in this particular topic today. Thank you. Over to Barbara.
Hi, I'm Barbara Zupancic, Director of Global Patient Recruitment and Retention here at Worldwide. And we work primarily recruiting patients globally into clinical trials, and we do this a lot already with online media and online advertising. And I have a psychology background, so I have an interest in speaking with people directly and communicating face-to-face. And so this topic is interesting to me because what we'll be talking about is really remote, and we're not, seeing patients face-to-face. So I'm very excited for today's discussion.
Okay. Dr. Murphy, back to you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Barbara. So we have an agenda, of course, and the topics are rather diverse, reflecting our different pedigrees. So Doug will speak to clinical assessments and siteless studies. He has a great deal of experience doing this recently, particularly for central nervous system disorder trials. Lorna is going to talk about an interesting experience she's had in an international setting, gathering in data in an observational study in cardiovascular disease, and so also some other insights. And then Barbara has a really interesting topic. I call it the rollout topic. So how do we roll out healthcare initiatives in a way that's informative and a way that's meaningful in order to transform healthcare using the information that all of us have developed during these registration programs? We begin with what this meeting is not about. The meeting is not about predictions. It's not about predictions for two reasons. One, I think you'll agree, an ability to predict evolving trends in technology has historically been very elusive, as represented by this very funny quote about the ENIAC computer that was popularized in Popular Mechanics in 1949. There are other equally compelling and funny quotes in hindsight from the 1950s through the 60s about what technology should look like, how it would be adopted, and what its utilization should be. But the second reason it's not about predictions is because all of us on the phone are involved in clinical research, drug discovery, commercialization. We're all very site and physician-centric. We are standing with the physician, we're speaking for the patient, and we're trying to honor our commitments. I don't know about you, but my first reaction when seeing new technology, at least speaking for myself, is, wow, that's really neat. Where can I buy it? Could we use it? Should we use it? And what are the range of issues that I'm sure someone in the organization is going to have about including that in a proposed study? So we're attempting to shape the future in a way to join all of you, basically, to shape the direction of clinical research rather than reacting to new developments, anticipating new developments, and trying to sort through some of the issues we might encounter and some of the opportunities that might exist. Now, you've all seen this. We all swim in this ocean. This is where we do clinical research, particularly commercialization and drug discovery. It's all about creating opportunity. There's a variety of different stakeholders here that impact research and development efforts. In my experience, they have incredibly different demands for data, not always orderly and sometimes not even logical. But nevertheless, if you're a trialist, if your business is designing, operationalizing, analyzing, and interpretation of interventional observational studies, these are the individuals that are asking us to supply data to inform decisions. Now, a personal note was one of the reasons I thought this was a great topic. Many of you possibly have went to the Orphan Drug Congresses. It's all a buzz about having assessments done at home. And it's prompted by one family that said to me, you know, doctor, I live 500 miles away from the nearest center. And if you design a study that has a visit structure which is too frequent, or if you include assessments and procedures, too many of them, in what I call a highly dense visit, our ability to participate and your ability to extract meaningful information will be very limited. And one recent indication that we've recently completed, we were literally flying people from Vladivostok to Moscow, that's 11 time zones, every 2 weeks to have a clinic visit. Certainly we can do better. So how do we accommodate these diverse interests? How do we adjudicate what are inherently conflicting agendas and interests in the process of evaluating new technologies? And importantly, how do we use technology to enable a siteless clinical trial, at least a partial one, that would give us more opportunities for research? So we're going to answer a few questions today. Does it promote innovation and design? We will march through in our presentation a prototypical development process, beginning with investigations as a component perhaps of earlier phase registration programs, then highlighting opportunities that can occur through observational research efforts. That's what Lorna will be focusing on. She'll be talking about what I call ecologically relevant information from representative patients and sites. And then finally, Barbara's going to address opportunities as we see them for using the information in order to enhance quality improvement initiatives in healthcare. So, does it promote innovation and design? Is it specific to a therapeutic area or a phase of research? Will utility vary by method of acquisition or by geography? Does that make a difference? What are those regulatory sentiments and data integrity issues? Here's one that I really think is interesting. Does it change the business model for a CRO or for a site? I think it might. What are the implications for the type of staff and the training of staff that would arise? And finally, is this only for research Is it for care delivery, or perhaps is it for both? Now, these, of course, are not the first discussions that have occurred on this topic. The initiative has been endorsed by many in the pharmaceutical and academic areas, as well as other CROs. So rather than presenting a very comprehensive overview, we've decided to simply highlight our experiences and our interest in the opportunities that we've had so that hopefully we can march out together in a collaborative research effort. Having said that, Doug, if you would, please.
Thank you, Mike. That's a very nice introduction. My part of the discussion will focus on specific clinical assessments, and it's a particular interest of mine because the department that I run is focused every day on ensuring the reliability of site-based assessments. And we do that through a variety of mechanisms, through ensuring training on those assessments and doing very specialized monitoring of those assessments throughout the study. So as I approach this topic, I see that there's lots of interest in the devices, the wearables, the smartphones, the continual monitoring type of benefits that you get from some of these devices and some of the new options that that medicine brings to clinical research through these devices. But ultimately, we know that all typical studies have multiple different safety and efficacy assessments that are within the protocol. Now, home-based studies may actually refine and reduce some of those assessments, which would be a great progress in patient centricity for these studies. But ultimately, we're still going to have a number of safety and efficacy assessments in the vast majority of these studies as we move towards more and more home-based or siteless studies. And in fact, if we're looking at biomarker or surrogate endpoints that might be coming from some of these devices and some of these therapeutic areas, we know that the FDA is often going to require that there are functional and or behavioral or symptomatic endpoints that come from those. And they're simply all not going to be captured through a wearable or through a device or through an electronic diary that's at the home or any other method that that might be innovative in this area. And so as I think about this and the movement of studies to be in home-based situations, I can also forecast that there will probably be more and more PRO assessments just given the nature of the patient-reported outcomes for many of these indications and for the movement from the site to a home-based type of situation. Patient-reported outcomes might be very amenable to this area and to this development in research. And even despite the fact that more and more of these studies may include patient-reported outcomes, the home-based studies, many of them will still have to rely on some clinical reported outcomes as well. I've abbreviated that as ClinRO versus PRO. And we cannot necessarily ignore those assessments and how we ensure the reliability of those assessments as we move towards home-based studies. That's why I kind of like this image of a blinded person, because there's so much attention focused on the devices and the wearables that we can't let other things fall to the wayside and not be considered. So as I think about this in two different categories, the patient-reported outcomes, I think, will be moving more and more and are very amenable to home-based studies. And as we think about developing protocols for home-based studies, it's good to know that Gananasaki has done a couple of very nice posters, a couple of very nice presentations in 2012 that cover this topic. The fact that the FDA is actually accepting more and more PRO claims as we go down. And this isn't just for secondary claims or claims associated with safety, but there was a surprising number of primary efficacy points associated with patient-reported outcomes. And there's a number of indications that are kind of obvious in this area. So pain was the number one therapeutic area for where patient-reported outcomes were being used, and we could easily envision how pain studies might be easily transferred into a home-based type of clinical trial setting. But surprisingly, there was a lot of other neurology type of assessments and indications that had PRO, even primary claims based out of PRO assessments. And if you look across the data that Gananasaki provided, you'll see that almost every therapeutic area was actually included in the patient-reported outcomes for primary or secondary efficacy claims. One odd outlier there is that oncology had no claims associated with patient-reported outcomes. And I think the nature of that indication is somewhat self-evident why that might not be amenable to PROs as a primary outcome. Nevertheless, I could see even oncology studies maybe being pushed more and more towards the home, especially if we're looking at supportive care indications within oncology. The combating wasting within oncology studies, or chemo-induced nausea and vomiting. Those type of studies might be very amenable towards home-based assessments as well. And so as we think about including more and more patient-reported outcomes in home-based studies, there's certain considerations that probably are pretty similar to regular site-based studies, but we have to be very aware that there's multiple patient-reported outcomes out there, and many of these PROs are named the same thing, but they actually have different purposes and different endpoints and specificities of what they're trying to measure. So you have to make sure that you're actually getting the right PRO for what you're looking at and having the right translations associated with that. And as we move into more regional-based studies, if we're talking about international countries, we know that in a lot of different countries that there are dialects that get more and more common as you get more and more rural. And so the consideration of whether or not that PRO has been translated not only into Russian or not only into Belarusian, but there are certain dialects that as you get more and more rural may or may not be appropriate for that particular translation of Belarusian for that PRO. So you have to be careful about those kind of things. We also have to make sure that the PRO is fit for use, and Gananasaki has some really nice data associated with that and why the FDA might reject that. And so we know many of those issues that are associated with fit for use, whether or not it's applicable, whether or not it is directly relatable to the underlying disease and indication. And then, but you have to make sure also that the statistical considerations have been covered for the multiplicity of assessments, and especially as we're looking at potential continual monitoring of data, does that change some statistical aspects of the sampling of that? You also have to always be mindful of the quality of the patient-reported outcome. Make sure that there's an appropriate recall period. Obviously, as you recall back further and further in time, the reliability of that recall is going to be decreased. But we also have to look at how you're going to deal with missing assessments. We're running a study right now where we're looking at a home-based cognitive assessment, a computerized cognitive assessment. And even though it's home-based, we're still getting data that is outside the window and missing data for those patients. So we still have some of the same issues that we deal with site-based studies associated with that. And even though the automatic consideration for a PRO for a home-based study might be electronic or ePRO, most people would automatically just assume that this is what we would use in a home-based study. We have data that shows for at least certain indications that the electronic PROs are actually not favored by patients. And these are associated with site-based studies, and so we haven't done the research specifically for home-based studies, but we've seen data from other companies that electronic PROs are actually very favored by patients. And so there's a little bit of a conflict of data there, and I think one of the main differences as you're thinking about a paper-based PRO for a home-based study or an ePRO is really the frequency of measuring, and so if it's a daily device that you're using and the patient gets used to entering in their blood glucose values or their pain assessments, every day or 3 times a day, whatever that might be, then the electronic PRO is a very good solution for that, and the patients get very familiar with that and they get comfortable with using the device. If it's a much less frequent assessment, like a cognitive assessment, for example, where the patient has a bit of a learning curve to use that device, you may want to consider maintaining a paper-based assessment and using a clinical expert to administer that particular scale. There's lots of different ways to think about that. But then as we think about even for PROs, normally what we do for PROs is that we train the staff on the proper administration of the PRO and how you introduce the PRO and the background of the PRO and what it's supposed to measure. We still will have to do that if there's any site-based visits associated with that PRO, but the training, I think, will need to then be focused more onto the patient. Right now we don't train the patients on the PROs because they are generally considered to be self-evident and the instructions are provided within the PRO in and of itself, but nevertheless, I don't think we can forget about how do we train and introduce and make sure that the patient is doing the appropriate time points and time of assessment and guidelines associated with that specific PRO. Most people would think of clinical reported outcome where you have a doctor or a specialized clinician doing an assessment, that this might be difficult to do for a home-based assessment. And I can tell you that we're actually doing remote administrations of very complex indications. One was the example where we have a computerized cognitive assessment for Alzheimer's patients, and another one where we are administering via phone a very complex depression assessment called the MADRS. And this is a 20 to 30-minute assessment that we do over the phone with a specialized clinician that is administering it with a patient that is at home or wherever they may be located during that assessment. So the clinical reported outcomes also should not be ignored as you're thinking about siteless studies and more home-based studies. And we know that the Clin rows are going to be standard for many of those subjective endpoints. And so a lot of those are going to be in CNS and psych indications, but there's also clinical reported outcomes that are going to be common towards many different indications, such as global measures of improvement, symptom severity, or a variety of safety and efficacy measures. Some of these new therapeutic compounds may have a component of sedation, and so measuring a sedation or a sleep effectiveness as a secondary efficacy or even as a safety assessment during the study may require a clinical reported outcome. And then as you think about clinical reported outcomes in siteless studies, you would want to think about what assessments should be done within the clinic and what assessments could or should be done at home. It could depend on which is your primary efficacy endpoint and whether or not you've had multiple home-based assessments done in the past. Do you want to continue to have that home-based assessment for your primary endpoint, or would it be more appropriate to bring that patient in at the week 12 or week 24, whatever that primary efficacy endpoint would be? And then you also need to think about whether or not that assessment can be done remotely via phone, or whether or not a qualified nurse might be able to do the assessment. For example, for any CNS active drug, the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, the CSSRS, has to be administered. And we would go through the process of looking at whether or not a nurse trained in that assessment would be appropriate to deliver that in a home-based setting, or whether or not this should be done in an ePro setting. And our opinion would be that a trained nurse would be able to do the CSSRS, but if it was the HAM-D or HAM-A or a more complex scale, then we would highly recommend that a very experienced and qualified clinician would do that. And we can do that either via phone, or we can actually do that with visiting clinicians which is what we've done in the past to actually send clinicians out to do remote assessments directly with patients. And then look at the applicability of the remote administration, whether or not it is appropriate to do that assessment via phone, whether or not it's appropriate to do that web-based. We would help you think through that overall consideration. And so, in general, I think what we're trying to present here is just to be very careful as we're moving forward into more and more siteless studies. And what we've seen, especially in this cognitive study that we've done, web-based, home-based and web-based cognitive assessments, is that some of those site-based issues that we experienced are now just pushed to home. And so, as I mentioned before, we still have incomplete and out-of-window assessments. How do we do that? We have still patient scheduling and compliance issues. Even though it's home-based and it's very convenient for the patient, there's still issues with patients completing those assessments within a window. And then we have a nurse that travels to the patient to do these web-based cognitive assessments and to help them with that. And even difficulties with a traveling nurse where they've had to cancel the last day, resulting in missing and out-of-window visits, is an issue that we have to address. So if you are using paper-based ClinROs or PROs at the home, you still have to work through the process of how are we going to gather those source documents and then verify those source documents. And then, as I alluded to before, with more and more home-based assessments, I think the shift of training the site versus training the patient will be something that needs to be carefully considered. And how do you train that patient so that there's reduction of biases while you continue to maintain the rigor and the validity of that scale? Ultimately, what we need to do, and ultimately what we do as a CRO and as a whole organization, is really look at that patient and family dynamics for the assessment. What is appropriate to do at home, what is not appropriate to do at home, and how to maximize the data quality associated with those assessments. With that, I'll move it on to Lorna.
Thanks, Doug. That was some very interesting points there. So for my section, I'm going to be focusing on the operational approach to siteless studies. And as you can imagine, being in project management, this is obviously an area of great interest. And working in late stage as well, some of these methods are already in practice with regards to siteless assessments of the patients. So move on to the first slide. So first, when you think about the assessment of patients, we need to understand the patient journey. So we need to understand the patient experience to enable us to use new technology. So we look at Generation X, Generation Y, and future generations, and they will have a relationship with technology that is truly integrated into their everyday lives. This integration can be used to benefit the long-term health promotion and treatment outcomes for these patients. By using methods of data mining and analytics, we can explore ways of extracting scientifically sound data to prove treatment cost-effectiveness and long-term patient outcomes for government agencies and healthcare providers. So, as you can imagine, there are many areas where we need to work together to ensure the best standard and practices. The points on this slide highlight areas where collaboration is needed to enable this area to mature and to evolve into new ways of operationalizing home-based assessments in order to implement true virtual studies, which in turn to our clients obviously means the reduction of cost of conducting research. One of the examples I'm going to use here, and it's well publicized, is Pfizer. They've actually set up in the past a virtual study where the patients enroll themselves, they enter all the data online, and the FDA was very encouraging of this and was very much in favor of this virtual study. However, despite the good setup of the technology, the recruitment wasn't ideal. But from this, we can learn lessons that we can use to improve the design and implementation of our studies. And some of these lessons come out of with regards to patient verification, how healthcare professionals and advocacy groups can be involved in the recruitment and promotion of these studies, and also how healthcare providers can encourage patients to trust the technology. These lessons can be used to improve research, and I think Doug touched on those points as well in his presentation. So as an example, and Dr. Murphy also mentioned this at the beginning of this seminar, that I currently work on a large cardiovascular study which has over 9,000 patients. 5,000 of these patients, we are currently collecting data using our direct-to-patient research contact center. So we call the patients to collect this data. So this is a remote assessment of the patients without the sites being involved. And this data is collected in 6 monthly intervals. And it's not just from the patient, also the caregiver information is collected as well. Currently our response rate is 90%, and which is quite a high response rate even after 3 years of research. And in some countries we have a response rate of up to 100%. So engaging and using methods and tools that suit the target population is essential to the success of conducting these studies. This is an efficient and effective method of collecting patient data, and it also reduces the burden of administration on the sites and is convenient to the patients. I think Dr. Murphy mentioned at the top of the meeting about patients being flown across time zones to go in for meetings. With the call center setup that we have for this particular study, the calls are conducted at a time and date that is convenient for them. The research, and on top of that as well as patient engagement with the patients as well, not just collecting data but keeping them engaged on long-term follow-up of studies, we have an automated local language SMS and emails that are sent to the patients to keep the study in mind. This also facilitates, and Doug has mentioned that in his meeting, in his slide, with regards to keeping the pro-assessments within the study window. So by sending these automated notifications, it keeps the study in the mind of the patient, and it also reminds them of their next call and when the next call is going to happen, which obviously leads to the 90 to 100% success rate of contact of the patients. Saying that, as you can imagine, with such a study, it has to go through regulatory approval, and we can tell you this, that the regulatory authorities are very open to new technology. However, we need to be engaging with the authorities earlier on in the conversation. Also, as an industry, we need to be more open to how we can utilize technology earlier on in our research. I'm sure many of you will agree that we are more experimental and open to new technologies in late-stage research, but tend to keep to a more traditional approach for earlier phases. How do we shift this mindset? How do we embrace the new technology in this era? And what does this mean to our stakeholders, such as patients, healthcare providers, government agencies and sponsors? We at WCT are very active in our discussions regarding what this will mean to us as a CRO. So my next point with regards to technology, technology has a strong impact on our everyday lives. How many of us would choose to live without our smartphones and our computers and tablets? There will be a greater impact on our working lives and how we will work within our cross-functional teams. In my day-to-day work, I've recently seen over the last year, 2 years, more and more interaction with our technology colleagues, our information technology colleagues and technical teams with regards to setup and ongoing maintenance of the studies that I work on. The IT team is very much a part of the cross-functional team, just as much as you would expect site management, regulatory. The information technology team is also involved more and more in every aspect of the project operations. As an industry, we will need to move forward by having smaller, leaner, very creative mindset teams, and that's the key, creative mindset teams, in order to move forward to conduct these types of studies in clinical trials as well in real-world research. As best practices and best standards, as we develop new practices and new standards, we will need to also look at the evolution of roles within the industry. For example, the CRA role may become more about training and less about monitoring, especially in late phase research. Data warehouse analytics will take center stage. So, as we move on, you can see there's many questions that remain unanswered. What we know is that technology and smart devices, including apps, will change how we conduct research, from data collection to patient engagement. We also need to consider a changing relationship between investigators, healthcare providers, and patients. Generation Y, the current generation just below me, are the most educated and informed generation this planet has ever seen. They and future generations will demand more from our healthcare. We already have remote doctor services. The control will move from the patient, from the doctor to the patient. As well as that, replacing healthcare professionals with computers. There has already been reports within the UK government with regards to using computer models that can take the medical decisions and medical protocols out of the hands of healthcare professionals. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? We have a choice. We can either be the driving force and be in a position to shape this new wave, or we can choose to be behind the wave and be pushed by it. So I'll just pass it on to my colleague, Barbara, who will go into more details.
Thank you so much, Lorna. A few years ago, I read a book called The Patient Will See You Now. The Future of Medicine is in Your Hands by Eric Topol, and it talks about the patient. It talks about you, me, your kids, your parents, being at the center and in his or her control of their health care. So by extension, we know that this is happening in many areas of our lives. We're better connected than ever, more knowledgeable, and more powerful to make informed decisions. So the shift from the physician being at the center is now changing to the patient being at the center. And this can be extended also for volunteering in clinical trials. And there's much discussion about conducting more and more assessments from the patient's homes, which will eventually lead to completely remote, siteless trials, putting the individual, rather the investigative site, at the center. So we already see this with, I'm very involved with online patient recruitment. As I mentioned earlier, advertising, pre-screener, that's already done remotely. So remote research has obviously been done for many years in observational studies. But with the exception of a pilot project that was done in OAB a few years ago, I believe, there have been no real interventional studies that are completely remote and siteless that have completed recruitment. So what are some of the benefits? Well, remote trials put research within the reach of many populations that otherwise wouldn't be able to participate. So if they're, geographic disparity, rare disease patients, patients with difficulty in mobility, we can get multi-stakeholder data. We can reach out to patients, their primary care doctors, specialists, caregivers. Potentially we could have one study coordinating center that can provide continual support via email, SMS text messaging, and or by the phone. We increase retention because patients are more engaged. They're certainly more comfortable and less burdened if they're in their home. We can decrease costs because we utilize less personnel, less monitors. And we can disseminate information. We can educate, support, all through the use of such things as site and patient portals, which we already do now. Let me just quickly touch on a few of the challenges, and we don't know the answers to all of these, but I just kind of jotted these down as we were preparing this presentation. So from the study I mentioned earlier in OAB, there were some lessons learned, and one of the challenges was there were concerns about putting large amounts of health information online. There was also burdensome online research processes, and the big one was a lack of human contact support. And these can be, and to an extent, were mitigated with appropriate safeguards to ensure data protection, and also a call center was added to add that human touch. And then another concern or a challenge, perhaps, is patients who are solely enrolled online tend to be more internet savvy and interested in their health, so from the general population. So hence the results may be less generalizable than those studies with randomly selected participants. A few more quick challenges: data integration, validation of apps, calibration of scales, passwords, data protection. Are we doing fingerprints, retina scans? If pain, for example, is a primary endpoint, how do we measure it? It's subjective. How accurate is this measurement? So on to my next slide. This basically shows you the virtual trial flow. It's a busy slide, but I kind of put the patient up there on top to show you how the process goes. So we start with recruiting. We recruit online through social media, banner ads, paid search, advocacy websites with and without pre-screener, and remote database searches that, for example, ePatient Finder uses. They can actually go into and mine physicians' databases. So this is already being done. This is really nothing new. We move on to enrollment. So enrollment can be done now already with e-consent, e-signature, and then recording the data. I'll be talking in a few moments about in-home nurses, telemedicine, and many, many phone apps that are out there. I had a whole slide of phone apps, but it was just too much. So very quickly, I will just give you an idea of what's out there. It's unbelievable. And this is being, done by different universities, like the NIH is doing it, private companies. So, for example, using a smartphone, you can use it as an otoscope for inner ear magnification. AliveCore is a company is doing a portable EKG. The iPhone as a glucometer. You can do skin testing for a skin scanner, for example. You're home, you have a lesion on your skin. Take a picture, use the dermatoscope, and send it in. Ultrasound for diagnosing all types of medical problems is being done by a company named Mabisanti. The iPhone is a Petri dish. Diabetes manager, blood pressure, glucose, saliva, urine. It's unbelievable. EEG, EKG. These are all some of the assessments that can be done, and they're not all in use. Some of them are still being studied. These can all be done from the phone. It's really phenomenal. And then finally we move on to retention, and we're doing this already, SMS text messaging, and retention should not be that difficult given that the patients are at home. So we really, really just need to make sure that we're constantly connected with the site and patient portal, pushing information out to the patients. That's super important. People want to know what's going on in a study. So this is just a high-level sort of siteless trials that, how we could make them work. And then I'll just quickly talk about home care and telemedicine. Nothing new here at all. You're most likely familiar with it. We use clinical trial nurses now, and they do phenomenal jobs in many different indications. They can assess subjects, administer product, draw specimens, conduct lab tests, use equipment like EEGs, EKGs. They provide source document, they educate subjects, and they also do surveys and questionnaires. So the benefits are, you can see them up there. I'm not going to read them to you. Obviously, very, very good for indications where patients are less mobile, the elderly, people who are really very sick and can't get into the site. So for future, I think a combination of using home health care and telemedicine. Telemedicine is used a lot now by physicians to specialists who might provide information to GPs or other specialties. Physicians use this all the time, also working with colleagues who might be in rural areas. And then for my final slide, I will just talk about the home assessments and the 4 types of studies that can be used for quality improvement initiatives. And the activities that are designed to change how healthcare is provided. So it's really a combination of behavioral changes, and through these changes, we can lead to more consistent, appropriate, and efficient application of established clinical interventions. And this can result, obviously, in improved care and patient outcomes, and we're always looking to improve quality of care. And you can see there are 4 here, and the wedge design, and then we have a time series design, and controlled and uncontrolled before and after studies. So we're just measuring outcomes in a different way, and I think each one has a lot of validity. So I think I've used up my allotted time, and I will pass it on to Dr. Murphy.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. What a cornucopia of different options. And what we thought we would do, everyone, and ladies and gentlemen, is kind of look back at the questions I initially raised and put Doug and Lorna and Barbara on the spot here to see how well we've done and whether they can answer some of these. I'm also going to interpolate some questions that I received from our good colleagues who are listening in today. So let's begin with this first one. Right now, you know my interest is in experimental design and innovative programs, so you know I put that first question there. So does this promote innovation in design and trial operations? And the quantum of effectiveness does not refer to the James Bond movie. It actually refers to an incredibly interesting article developed by Frank Sasanowski, who is chairman of the board for NORD, who reviewed the evidentiary standards for approval for a number of different orphan drugs. One could probably, I'm sure, teach a course in experimental medicine just using that one publication. Having the ability to place the assessments at home, whether they're physiological assessments, functional measures, and so forth, opens up a world of different opportunities for engaging in very, very innovative research that would be highly informative and, as I like to say, ecologically relevant, so that the data that we generate during the typical registration program will generalize and map into the practice of medicine. So the second one, Doug, is for you. We had a few questions about this. So what do you think, Doug? Is it specific to a therapeutic area? Is it specific to a phase of research? I mean, could you imagine some of your techniques being used in highly debilitated patients such as those with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, dementia? How do you see it?
Yeah, certainly I think it could be applicable to the vast majority of indications out there. Obviously, survivability with oncology might be a limitation there, as I indicated. And based on phase, I think certainly not phase 1, but for proof of concept in phase 3 and even phase 4 studies, I think they could be used, home-based studies could be used more and more. And it really, I think, depends on what you're measuring as your as some of your key safety or efficacy measures, whether or not it would be appropriate for that study to be pushed more to home-based assessments. And so obviously if it's easily measured through a device or through electronic means, then that makes it more and more amenable to those site-based studies. But we did have that question that came up about psych indications and whether or not PROs or these assessments would be appropriate for home-based assessments. And my assessment there is that for primary entry or efficacy assessments for psych indications, I would have to imagine that those would still need to be administered and gauged by an expert clinician, unless there's a new method of 10 years down the road that we can just do eye tracking and that becomes a surrogate endpoint for cognition, something like that. But as the assessments stand right now, those psych and neurocog assessments are so complex and intricate that it really needs to be done by a trained professional. But there are PROs and other ClinROs that still can be implemented for home-based studies and for secondary endpoints or even quality of life or work readiness kind of assessments. So
Doug, one of our colleagues has indicated they've actually done it in phase 1. So I tell you, my feeling is, folks, we could probably do this in every phase and in most therapeutic areas with appropriate qualifications, of course. So really exciting. Well, all of us work globally. My goodness, the globalization of clinical research has been written about by a number of people. And so the question comes up, and Lorna, I'm going to toss this one to you. So does it change by geography? I mean, does the utility vary by method of acquisition? Does it change when you work in Asia-Pacific countries versus...
Yes, thanks, Dr. Murphy. Yes, it depends, actually. As I mentioned when I was doing my presentation, the total number of patients is 9,000, but we actually conduct the call center activities for 5,000 patients, and the reason for that is for the Asia-Pac region, the call center method could be quite challenging, so we have to be culturally sensitive with regards to which methods that we use in each particular country. And also for Brazil, for the Latin American countries, particularly Brazil, when we had the approval for using the call center, one of the conditions of the approval was the fact that the call center person wouldn't be based in Brazil. And the reason for that is because they thought there may be a possibility that that patient may know the call center person, the RCA, may know the patient or the caregivers of that patient. So we have the two hubs, one in the UK to service Europe, and another hub in the US to service North America and Latin America. But with regards to the Latin American Brazilian patients, the RCAs, the call center personnel in the UK actually call the patients from the UK. So with regard to the geography, obviously we need the call center team to be very flexible with their approach with regards to being available to contact the patients at a time that is convenient to them. So the call center team is available to contact them in the evenings, on weekends, first thing in the morning if, they want to be called first thing in the morning. So yes, the geography has an impact on whether or not you can roll out all of these different types of methods, siteless methods. And as I mentioned, for China, it was problematic because of the way that the relationships between the physicians and the doctors, and also the fact that the patients don't like to be approached by someone they don't know. And that was also the same kind of experience as well for Japan as well, where the sites and the patients, the relationship between the sites and the patients was the sort of primary relationship, and the patients themselves didn't want to be contacted by someone they didn't know. Having said that, the usual approach within China and Asia is that the patient comes in and then they would do the assessment. But during the progress of the study, we've noticed that the sites have also adopted the calling of the patients as well in order to collect the data from them. So we can see, even in a short period of time, how by encouraging and discussing the technology in different ways of contacting patients, that the sites are quite ready to adapt a different way of approach of contacting patients to collect data. So, Dr. Murphy, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. In fact, Laura, your response is generating a lot of interest here. So let me ask you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm interested in this. So do any of us know of a region or a country where a truly siteless study has been conducted and endorsed by the regulatory authorities? Is that one of us have heard? I want to say no, but I don't. I've been known to be incorrect frequently, and I don't want to speak for the team. How do you see it?
Off the top of my head, I'd say no, but as I mentioned in my example, it has been done by other companies, and one of the sort of drawbacks of the verification of patients and also enrollment as well was quite poor on that particular study, despite the technology being very, very good. So obviously we can learn lessons from that in order to encourage patients to enroll and be part of these sort of virtual studies. But I do believe, moving forward with the new generation of people that are coming up, that these types of studies will become the norm, really.
Okay. I'm respectful of time. There's so many good additional ideas on this one, but I have to put Doug on the line. Here it is, Doug. What about the regulatory sentiments and data integrity issues? You know, I read an interesting quote that says everyone believes strongly that we need to have, toothbrushes, but no one wants to use anyone else's toothbrush. So standardization, regulatory sentiments, data integrity, how do you see it?
Yeah, that is a great quote about standardization. Everybody wants their own, but doesn't want to use other ones. So this is really a complex question. It really comes down to the specific purpose of what you're trying to do. And if you're looking across multiple countries, or if you're just looking at a single U.S. submission, if it's a health resource utilization study, and that's all you're trying to measure, then that's going to be a lot more simple than if you're trying to do a primary efficacy study. And again, it depends on what output you're looking at. If you're looking at blood glucose levels, it's probably going to be a lot more simple than if you're looking at some complex psych indications. So it really takes a customized thought and approach to that particular answer.
Right. There are also some additional questions that we'll respond to offline about, whether or not we're using devices that are not approved as medical devices nor intended for human clinical research. Great questions. Everyone has quite a bit on this. Ladies and gentlemen, we've unfortunately, run out of time here, and we were just getting into the great discussion. Here's the commitment. We want to respond to some of these other questions on the list. I particularly have a lot of thoughts about how this could be transformative, how CROs organize themselves, the type of service offerings that they offer. I think it'll change the way sites are staffed and how they operate as well. We commit to you that we will respond to those questions and make them available for your review. So with that, I'll simply thank you, and Colleen, ask you to close the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Murphy. This concludes today's webinar. As Dr. Murphy mentioned, if we did not get to your question, we will be sure to reach out to you. And as a reminder, all attendees will receive a link to view the recording. For more information, we invite you to visit worldwide.com. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and have a wonderful rest of the day.